Hello, my name is Chris Prescott. I'm a partner and immigration attorney at Patel Law Group. We're in Dallas, Texas. This is the first video of a series on the E-2 investment visa. So if you're an entrepreneur and you're looking to either purchase an existing business or set up a new business, this video series is for you. So let's break it down. What is the E-2 visa? Well, you have to be a citizen of a country where there is a treaty of commerce and navigation in place between the US and that country. You have to invest a substantial amount of money, and I'll explain what that means in subsequent videos. You also typically have to own at least 50% of the business, and you have to be coming here to direct and develop that business, and then the business cannot be marginal. So if this sounds like something for you, check out our remaining videos. So how do you know if there is a treaty in place to qualify you for an E-2 visa? Well, the Department of State, on their website, they have a list of all the E-2 treaty countries. There's over 70, Australia, UK, Canada, Mexico. Unfortunately, India is not on that list. So if you were born in India and you don't have any other nationalities, you don't qualify for an E-2. However, the good news is it's not based on country of birth. So if you were born in India, let's say you've moved to Canada and you're now a Canadian citizen, you can qualify and do an E-2. Or let's say you were born in the UK, you qualify for an E-2. So it's not restricted to country of birth. If you later pick up a nationality, that may allow you to do an E-2. Go to the Department of State website. We'll include the link in this video, and that will help you determine whether you qualify for an E-2 investment visa. A common question about the E-2 visa is what type of business qualifies for an E-2? And the answer, honestly, is any type of business. We've done them for liquor stores. I'm currently working on one for a franchise. We did one previously for an accounting kind of bookkeeping business. It really is any business where you can invest a substantial amount of money and which you can show is likely to succeed and make a profit. Let's talk about the 50% ownership of the E-2 business. So somebody had asked me recently, hey, can I do an E-2 but own less than 50%? And the answer is yes. So the requirement is that you're coming here to direct and develop that business. That's either through showing that you own 50% of the business or that you have operational control, which means that you have a managerial position. You essentially have full control of the business. So if there's other partners, those partners need to agree that you have control of that business. And that can be demonstrated through affidavits. It can be in the operating agreement. I think it's reflected in the type of position that you have. So if you're the CEO or the president, you can show that you're really running that business, even if you only have, let's say, 30 or 40% ownership. That will still work for an E-2 investment visa. Let's talk about marginality. So one of the requirements for the E-2 is that the business cannot be marginal. But what does that really mean? So marginality means that the E-2 business must generate a sufficient income for you and your family. So if the business doesn't make too much money, it's not necessarily going to meet the marginality requirement. If it generates, a decent income for you and your family, let's say you hire, a couple of US workers, it's going to let you overcome that marginality requirement. So it's not like the EB-5 where there is a job creation requirement. However, because of the marginality, I typically recommend hiring, 1 to 2 people if possible. Sometimes it's not always a requirement, and it really just depends on the nature of the business. Is the E-2 visa a green card? The answer to that is no. The E-2 is a non-immigrant visa or a non-immigrant status, similar to like a H-1B or an L-1. There is something else called an EB-5, which is an investment green card, but that's very distinct from the E-2. It has different requirements. There's job requirements, job creation requirements. The investment amounts are very different. Somebody could, in theory, come here on an E-2 and later do an EB-5, but the two things are very different. So the E-2 is not a green card and shouldn't be confused with the EB-5. How long can you stay on an E-2 visa? So the amount of time that you can stay in the States compared to the visa itself is very different. So depending what country you're from, you may end up getting a 5-year E-2 visa in your passport. Doesn't mean you can stay in the States for 5 years. So typically, when you get admitted to the state, you'll be admitted for 2 years, which means you'll be in valid E-2 status. You can run that business for 2 years, and then you either have to leave and re-enter, or you would have to apply for an extension. So it's limited to 2 years, but in theory, as long as you're running that E-2 business, you could stay on an E-2 for, let's say, 20 years. How do you apply for an E-2? Well, that will depend on whether you're currently in the US in another status or outside of the US. And every consulate has different rules. So for example, we just did an E-2 for a client from the UK. We had to prepare the E-2 packet. We had to email it to the consulate in the UK in London. They had 60 business days to review it, and then they called our client for an interview. The case got approved, and then he recently entered the US. However, if you're already in the US in another status, let's say you're here on, I don't know, H4 EAD, you can apply for a change of status by submitting I-129 to USCIS. You're thinking of applying for an E-2 and are wondering if your spouse and children can accompany you. Well, the answer is yes. Spouse and kids 21 or under can come to the States with you. They'll be admitted for the same duration. So normally 2 years, as I said in the previous video. So spouse and kids will also get 2 years. The great thing for the spouse is they're authorized to work incident to status, which means they don't have to apply for a separate work authorization. The minute they land in the US, they can start working, and that means they can work for the E-2 business, or they can even get a job at Starbucks. They can do anything they want. It provides completely unrestricted work authorization. Do you need a business plan for an E-2 visa application? And the answer is yes. So an E-2 requires you to either purchase an existing business or set up a new business. And you have to convince immigration, whether that's USCIS or the US consulate, that this is a well thought out business, that it's likely to succeed, that you're somehow qualified to run this business, or at least have the experience and, have given it the proper kind of thought and have looked at the competition and all of those things. And the best way to do that is to give them a very detailed business plan. That business plan ideally should either be prepared by an attorney or by a company that specializes in E-2 business plans. Let's talk about source of funds for an E-2 investment visa. So one of the requirements is you have to demonstrate to immigration that the money is not from criminal activity. You have to show that you legally own those funds, which requires you to essentially document where you got the money from. It can be from personal savings, money that you've earned, money that's been gifted. It can even be from a loan. It can't be secured by the assets of the business, but it can be secured by personal assets. And it requires a lot of documentation. Source of funds is probably one of the most complex parts of both E-2 and EB-5 and requires a substantial amount of documentation. So you need to be able to convince immigration that the money is legal and is being invested in the business for E-2 purposes. This is the last video in the E-2 series. So we've talked about the fact that the investment has to be substantial, the business can't be marginal. We've talked about the period of authorized stay. We've talked about source of funds. We've talked about the fact that an E-2 is not a green card and it's simply a non-immigrant visa. Getting an E-2 is not that difficult as long as you work with somebody that's experienced, as long as you provide proper documentation, a detailed business plan. Whether you contact myself or another attorney, I strongly recommend working with somebody that has handled E-2 cases before. If you want to reach out to myself, you can email me at cprescott@patellegal.com. Thank you for listening.